Hello, programmers! Today I want to talk about functions in Swift, and I'm going to use Xcode. I'm going to start with a playground. I'm doing File, New, and Playground, and the blank, empty template is fine for that. I'm going to leave iOS selected, leave blank selected, and come up with some kind of unique name for my playground. So mine's going to be like function test. And we'll just create a few test functions. The playground starts out with a couple lines. I don't need either one of those. So I'm assuming that most of my audience has done another language and they've written a function in another language. In Swift, your functions start with func and then your name of your function. So I'm going to define a function called say hello that simply prints hello. And then that would define the function to call the function. I've got say hello, and then we can just hit run to run this in the playground. Even though it said there was an error, there's no error anymore. And we look at the bottom, and here's where we see the output where it prints hello. Excellent. So let's go ahead and we can call this function more than once by putting it inside of a for loop. So I'm going to say for x in 1 to 5, and I've got 3 little dots there between the 1 and the 5. So one of the advantages to writing a function is that you can call it more than one time. So we're calling the function 5 times. And I intentionally wanted to point out this warning. It's not that I did anything wrong, it's just suggesting an improvement for the code. It's saying because you didn't use the value of x, immutable or unchangeable, you weren't changing x, and you weren't using it, well, I mean, we're going from 1 to 5, but we're not actually using the variable x anywhere in that for loop, so we could replace it with an underscore. And I'm going to go ahead and say, let's make that fix. It's still, the code works the same, but we don't need to have a variable called x. Using the underscore is an unnamed variable that we're using. And that'll come back later when we're talking about functions. So that is how you would call a function that doesn't take any input arguments and it doesn't return anything. Let me change this function so it takes an input argument. And I'm going to say it takes I'm going to say your name of who you want to say hi to. And with Swift, it's possible to have 2 names associated with a value that your function's using. The first one is an external parameter, and the second one is my local parameter. And then finally, you'll have a colon and then the data type of what you're using, so a string. So that was a mouthful. Let me explain that first. So the function is going to use the second one, the local name of that variable, but you can, when you're calling the function, use the external parameter, so your name. Sometimes this helps make self-documenting code. You've got 2 different names for it. Not a lot of the times, I don't think it's that helpful when you're coming from other languages. Most other languages don't do it quite like this, so it's a little bit confusing. So it's possible to get rid of that first name or get rid of either one. So you've only got one name for this, and now we're going to say, okay, local name is the only one, and this will still work. Another thing I've seen is, what if you don't want to have to pass in a name? You just want to pass in the string. You don't want to pass in an external parameter name. So we can use an underscore, just like we did with that for loop. The underscore is an unnamed parameter. So it's unnamed as far as when you're out of the function, and when you're in the function, we've got this local parameter. So that'll work as well. Let's pass in a second value to the function. Let's say that this function also will take, I'll do another unnamed parameter. It'll also take the number of times that you would like to say hello to someone, and that'll be an int. and then we could use a for loop around that, for x in 1, 2, 3, and it's gonna yell at me just like it did last time and say that I'm not really using the x value, so why don't I use the underscore instead? And once it yells, I'll go ahead and fix that. It's also, the first thing it's going to notice is that my function says it takes 2 input arguments, but I'm only passing in 1. So let me say I want to say hello to Mary 6 times. And now it'll work. Why do I not? Oh, I'm using, that's silly. I'm using 3 all the time instead of using that second argument that I was passing into the function, which is the number of times that I actually want to say hello to Mary. I'm going to let it fix this for me so that I've got that as an unnamed variable there. I'm also going to provide a default. So I kind of already had in mind that my default I wanted was 3, that if you don't pass in a second argument, I want to say hello 3 times. So we'll say hello to Bob, and because we don't have that second argument, it's going to use the default of 3. All right, one more thing I want to show with functions, and that is returning a value from a function. So I'll do a different function called calculate the tip. And we'll say this function takes 2 inputs. It takes your bill total, which my local variable name, because I don't want to type a really long name, is going to just be B, and that's going to be a float. And then how much you are willing to tip in percentage, we'll call that T. That's also going to be a float. And then we're going to return, the way you show what you want to return from the function is this arrow, and then the data type that we're returning. So you're going to have to pay your bill, so the local variable or local parameter is B, and then B times the percentage you want to tip should give how much you want to tip. So let's go ahead and try that. I'm going to calculate the tip for, let's say that I have a bill of $100 and I want to tip 15%. I'm purposely typing 0.15 just to show you another thing about Swift is that when you're typing in something that should start with a 0, like we know that that is 0.15, but Swift really wants you to put that 0 in there. It says it's not valid without it. So we'll say if you want to type in tip 15%, then you're going to end up paying $115. Let's put in a default for the tip amount. So it's pretty common. A lot of people like to tip 15%. So we could call that function again. I'm going to store how much you're paying inside of a variable just to show that way of doing it. And the bill total, I'm going to stick with 100 because it sure makes the math easy. And if I leave off the tip, then I should see I'm calculating the same $115 that you're going to end up paying. We could change the tip and say, oh, it was great service, 25%. And now we're the first time we're calculating it, we're going to end up paying $125. All right, that's just a little overview of functions in Swift. Happy programming!